I'm going to go to Rushanara now, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to return to unemployment. I know you've touched on it already, but just looking at the overall figures, the MPC's projections are that unemployment peaks at 7.4% in the middle of 2021, falling gradually to 4.5% in the first quarter of 2024. And yesterday, of course, just looking at the data that came out yesterday, we got a flavour of the impact on certain groups. Women are faring worse now. Ethnic minorities twice as likely to have experienced unemployment in the last year. Young people, 420,000 young people unemployed in the last year on top of the 600,000. And then I expect there'll be regional variations. So could you talk through, perhaps so I can start with Ben Gordon and then go on to the governor. Could you talk through how you see things emerging, particularly obviously you mentioned the vaccine in the forthcoming period, and what the government can do and what the bank can do in terms of limiting the scarring effects in terms of certain regions, but also those particular groups that have been hit very hard?
Yeah, thank you. It is unfortunately always the case, even in a normal downturn, to the extent such a thing exists, that when unemployment goes up, it tends to be the less well paid, the young, who more often lose their jobs. So recessions are regressive. And as I said a moment ago, regrettably, that's been even more the case during this episode because of the nature of the jobs in the areas of the economy that have been hardest hit. And consumer services and leisure, hotels and restaurants and shops tend to have less well paid, more marginally attached jobs. Now, part of the task of stabilizing inflation is to stabilize swings in demand and to minimize swings in unemployment. That's not to say they never happen. But under inflation targeting, they have been milder, less acute. And that is an absolutely key judgment on the part of unemployment as to how we set monetary policy. Indeed, it's the fact that we anticipated and continue to anticipate that unemployment will go up that explains in large part why we have eased monetary policy in the way that we have.
And can I just push you on regional variations, because that's another dimension to unemployment that we've seen in the 80s and in other periods after the previous recessions. You'd say the same, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know as compared with the 80s. The 80s was extraordinary in its sort of regional concentration. It was a very heavily manufactured.
But how do you see? Can you comment on the regional variations? What are you seeing? What are your, we've had these debates in this committee in the past, in previous parliaments, about the fact that macroeconomic policy doesn't dig deep enough, for understandable reasons, into regional variations, into the scarring effects on certain communities in certain parts of the country, as well as certain demographics. We've never really got to a satisfactory conclusion about what central banks can do to blunt the impact. And this crisis has hurt these groups even more. So it would be quite unsatisfactory for the country to hear, yes, this is a pattern, but what do we do about it? Is there more that our central bank can do, or is it just?
Well, look, as I say, the most important. Let me begin with a sort of one slightly technical one. We have one instrument of policy.
Yeah.
That means we can hit one objective, not many objectives, or at least we can't hit them all equally well if we're given more than one. But it is the case that in seeking to stabilize inflation, what we effectively do is to seek to stabilize spare capacity and to minimize swings in unemployment. And that goes in the direction of minimizing these regressive job losses. So we recognise entirely that's been the case. It's extremely regrettably, it's been the case in every single country in 2020, thanks to the nature of the pandemic and what it's done to certain areas of the economy. But the best thing we can do is what we're tasked to do, which is to minimise swings in spare capacity, including unemployment, in order to meet inflation. So although it's not directly our objective to target particular areas of employment, whether regionally or by other cuts, the effect of what we do is to minimize those swings. And that's what we continue to be focused on. And as I said earlier, that's the reason why, principally, that we've already eased monetary policy. It's in the unfortunate expectation that we will see further increases in unemployment.
Okay, thank you very much. Governor, can I just take you to just reflect on some of the things you said last September about furloughing, given that when we do these restrictions, the government will be removing the furloughing scheme. In the light of these variations to some groups, what do you think? How do you think the government should exit the scheme, such as the furloughing scheme, given certain sectors have been hit hard? And what sort of support do you think is needed to not find ourselves in a situation where we get a cliff edge in terms of unemployment levels, because we've got millions of people who are still in furlough, and the transition towards opening up is going to be a tough one for businesses and their employees?
Yes, well, look, as we've said a few times already this afternoon, obviously we're not going to comment on what should be in the budget. That's strictly for the Chancellor. But let me I think it's a really good question. So let me try and lift it to a somewhat higher level of elevation. I think, and the UK is much like other economies in this respect. I think what we've been going through and are still in is what I would call the first phase, which is very much a phase of widespread support of economic policy for the dealing with the pandemic itself. And it seems to me that's entirely appropriate. And although the policy mix has differed at a level of detail across countries, some have gone for some mix of support policies, others for others, broadly that's what we've all been doing, and it's right. And that's still continuing. Now, as you say, we will, fingers crossed, signs are, we're going to come out of that. And there will come a point, and I'm not going to speculate on when that point is, because that strictly is for the Chancellor, where I think the logic of that approach indicates that the measures should become more targeted and more supportive, really, to the very good point you make about the impact of this shock on communities, the uneven impact. As you said, it's age, it's income, it's gender, it's ethnicity. It's all the things that we least want to observe and experience, and it needs to become more targeted. Now, you raised the 80s, which is very interesting. I am more optimistic on that front, because I think the 80s was a period where the economy went through a very sort of wrenching. I'm not talking about politics now. I'm talking about economics. Wrenching structural change away from heavy industry, away from mining, to over time to the economy we have today. I don't think that we will go through that in the post-COVID period, and that's why, by the way, we've got a relatively low number for sort of scarring, as you said, in our forecast. It's a fairly small number by comparison with the sorts of numbers that you can get by looking at the 80s, but it still will happen, as Ben was saying.
Governor,
yeah,
just to probe you on that, I appreciate the analysis you're giving, but the fundamentals are that those groups that were hurt in the 80s, the demographics that found themselves frankly stuffed in the 80s, that is not changing. Regional issues, regional variations, those at the bottom end of the society. So there's a constant there, and in fact, this pandemic is exacerbating it. And so the question is, how do some groups end up being hit hard, as Mr. Broadbent just pointed out, and the data shows, in constituencies like mine, poorer people fare worse in every indicator. Black and minority groups are dying in larger numbers. So the consequences are huge.
That's terrible.
So the question then is, how do we, 420,000 in a year of youth unemployment is still a significant number. It's a lot of lives. So how do we move past and also looking to the future? How do we ensure that we address this? Now, I'm not saying you can do it on your own, given your limited number of instruments. Are we saying that the government, it's got to be the government only, beyond what you're doing? And what is it? What are the things that are going to make a big difference?
Oh, and I was seeking to agree with you, actually, in a sense, in the big picture sense of what there will come a point where we need to shift from this, what I call sort of, large scale support phase, of which, by the way, the furlough scheme has been a very, very important, I think, successful part, to the more targeted approaches, which make sure that people like your constituents who you've been talking about, who need the assistance, get the targeted assistance. Because if, for instance, it's a matter of saying we need to provide them with the training and skill building opportunities, because things that they have been doing in the past just don't come back in the new world for whatever reason. COVID leaves this effect on the economy, that there are certain activities that just don't come back, or they don't come back anything like to the full extent they used to. Then we need to target, in the broadest sense, the policies to help them get the training, get the skills, get the opportunities. Because what we know from the past is that one of the things that is most destructive for people, most importantly, but also for the economy, is longer term structural unemployment. That's what we had coming out of the 80s in much greater extent. We must avoid that. Now, as I say, I'm more optimistic for the one reason, which is I think where the parallel with the 80s, yes, there's sort of, you're right, there are sort of specifically badly affected groups. I think the added thing in the 80s was that there was very sort of concentrated, if you like, sort of redundancy of skills, and it was geographically concentrated, much more so. I don't think the economy is the same today. It's changed in that respect. But please don't assume anything I've just said takes away from what I share with you, which is the importance of making sure that those groups that are much more badly affected get the support going forwards when it is right to target.
Yeah, well, I hope the Chancellor's listening to you in what you're saying here. Jonathan Haskell, you put your hand up, and while you're answering, could you also reflect on the point about the number of EU migrants, 1.3 million who've left the UK, a significant number, hundreds of thousands from London, and that means that if they lost jobs and left, those numbers won't be reflected in unemployment data. What are the implications of if they were to return, and costs of that? And do you see unemployment, the impact of Brexit on unemployment? How do you compare that with coronavirus and its impact on unemployment?
Thanks very much. I just wanted to come in before I answer those good set of questions to echo what the Governor and Ben were just saying. Obviously, nobody on this committee, wants to ignore or in any way minimise the hardship that people face. And you mentioned your constituency, in Bethnal Green and Bow, there's obviously, massive amounts of hardship being faced. But as we were talking about, I think the analogy with the 80s is misplaced. Can I just try a fact? In the 80s, when we went into the 80s recession, roughly speaking, 25% of value added was in manufacturing. That in about 10 years, that fell to about 10%. If you look at that span of 10 years and ask about hotels and restaurants, which are perhaps the most affected by the COVID situation, that's gone from about 4% of the economy to around 6% of the economy. So again, I don't want to.
With respect, I was reflecting to Ben Broadbent's point, which is that certain groups fare worse, and that's well documented, well established, than others in recessions. And in that sense, there will be common traits between different recessions.
I completely agree. I just wanted to get some numbers on the table about manufacturing, since we were talking about manufacturing. Yes, but going on to the Brexit issue, so this is a difficult issue, and as you'll have read the report by Jonathan Portes and Michael O'Connor, where they do try and record these numbers. I think we're still trying to get our arms around this number, because as you know, the source of the difficulty is that the response rates to the labour force survey have fallen very sharply. They've fallen by 15% overall. They've fallen about 30% for foreign-born people and 12% 5% for UK born. And because the ONS don't quite know how to react to all of that, they've had to make, various adjustments and so forth. It could just be, and here I should declare an interest. I sit on the UK Stats Authority, so it looks after the ONS, and so I declare an interest there. It could just be that this is genuinely a sampling problem, that the underlying population hasn't changed, but the sampling difficulties have brought this about. And you'll know, Rushanara, that the sampling difficulties are incredibly difficult, right? Phoning up people and going around and asking people in the current conditions is very, very hard. So I think the situation there is very much watch this space, because those numbers are consistent with, as I say, nothing happening in the underlying data at all, it just being a sampling problem, or they're consistent, as you suggested in your question, with a large number of foreign people going home. The extent to which they would have been unemployed, and therefore whether that is incident on unemployment, of course, I think we don't know that yet. So I think as far as the bank is concerned, and this goes back to what you were asking Ben earlier on, in terms of our projections for unemployment and all of that, we will be working very closely with the ONS to try to figure out what all those various numbers were. And lastly, you asked about Brexit and the implications for Brexit. So again, without a solid handle on the various movements that have been in and out, it's a little early to say what those Brexit movements are. Generally, I think the evidence seems to suggest that the movement of migrants has got a rather small effect on labour markets. But as I say, we're somewhat in the dark here. But I hope, as I say, with a bit of cooperative work with other agencies, we can get a much clearer picture soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.